I'm here today with Hayley Phelps from the Restructuring and Insolvency team here at HCR to talk about how to manage practice debt. So Hayley, what are your tips?
The first tip is to keep an eye on the balance sheet and cash flow so that any issues can be identified in advance. It's worth speaking to suppliers to see whether new credit terms could be agreed or instalment payment plans. It's worth speaking to the bank and HMRC to consider payment plans or time to pay arrangements. It's always worth keeping key stakeholders up to date so that they're aware of the company's position and they don't get worried about any short-term difficulties that the practice may be in. It's also worth reviewing the practice's own suppliers, as they may have their own issues as well, and it's also always more difficult to find a new supplier at short notice when your bargaining position may not be as strong. And the other key step is to keep on top of the practice's own debtors. Consider what credit terms that you're giving your customers and chase regularly to keep that cash flow coming in.
So what about options for practices who find themselves in a distressed position?
It's worth reviewing and amending business and marketing plans, identify the key drivers of profit and eliminate any unnecessary costs that aren't really needed for the practice. Again, keep on top of the practice accounts so any issues can be identified in advance. Try to agree terms with creditors. You can consider the sale and lease back of assets to try and reduce the cash outflow there. Make sure you chase all outstanding invoices and debts to keep money coming into the practice. You could consider renting rather than buying equipment to reduce that initial outlay if there is a need to get something new in. On a sort of larger scale, you can consider a refinancing of practice debt to perhaps get the benefit of a lower interest rate. There are certain grants available that may be worth considering, and also invoice factoring if the practice does have some significant outstanding invoices as well.
So what can practices do if things become more serious?
The key is to take advice as soon as possible from either a professional insolvency practitioner or solicitors specialising in this area. Especially if the practice operates as a company, the directors need to consider their duties during times when the practice may be more distressed. And the sooner this advice is obtained, then the more options are available to the practice. If a director has given, or a sole operator has given a personal guarantee to a bank, then they may also need to consider their own personal position and take advice on that.
And lastly, are there any regulatory considerations?
It's not an automatic issue if the practice is in distress or does ultimately enter an insolvency process. However, you need to consider whether you can still abide by the declaration given on admission to the Royal College. There is a requirement to notify the Royal College within 3 months of any adverse findings in relation to the practice, and arguably a distressed practice could meet this criteria.